How many men have lost emotional control trying to understand a woman who seemed like she just wanted a reaction? And the worst part, without realizing that was exactly what she wanted. If she's trying to make you jealous, do this instead, isn't just about jealousy. It's about emotional power, self-control, and what actually makes a man respected. Because once, if she's trying to make you jealous, do this instead, finally clicks for you, the way you see relationships completely changes. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now, because here you'll learn the kind of things most men realize way too late. And we're trying to hit 1,000 subscribers with men who genuinely want to become emotionally stronger. Topic 1. Why she's trying to make you jealous in the first place. Most men assume that when a woman tries to make them jealous, it's because she found someone better. But honestly, most of the time it's not really about the other guy. What's actually happening is way more psychological than people think. A lot of times she's trying to measure the emotional effect she still has on him. She wants to feel like she can still get under his skin. And once a man understands that, he stops acting like he's losing and starts seeing the emotional game that was happening behind the scenes the whole time. It's interesting how many people confuse attention with connection. A woman might post something provocative, casually mention another guy, or suddenly act differently around him not because she lost interest, but because she's trying to regain emotional validation. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. Emotionally insecure people tend to test feelings instead of communicating them directly. It's like someone shaking a table just to see if it's still stable. The problem is that most men react in the exact way that destroys their emotional position, without even realizing it. And here's the ironic part. The more desperate a man becomes trying to regain control of the situation, the more he reveals that the emotional center of his life is sitting in her hands. And women notice that fast. An emotionally strong man observes before he reacts. He understands that manufactured jealousy usually doesn't come from strength. It comes from uncertainty, attention-seeking, and fear of losing emotional influence. But there's one specific mistake that makes almost every man fall into this trap instantly. And that's where everything usually starts falling apart. Topic 2. The biggest mistake men make when they notice it. The biggest mistake a man can make when he realizes she's trying to make him jealous is jumping straight into the emotional game. And this happens all the time. Suddenly he starts acting differently, sending impulsive texts, competing with other men, demanding attention, or completely changing his energy. Without realizing it, he goes from looking centered and confident to looking emotionally affected. And as unfair as it sounds, attraction rarely grows when someone realizes they can easily control another person's emotional state. A lot of men think intense reactions prove love, masculinity, or genuine interest. But in reality, it usually communicates emotional anxiety. It's like a poker player showing his cards way too early. A confident man doesn't feel the need to react to everything immediately. He watches patterns before making decisions. And this applies even to small situations. An emotionally intelligent guy doesn't stop his workout, ignore his work, or ruin his whole routine because he saw a picture that triggered his ego at 2 in the morning. It sounds small, but those little details are exactly where masculine self-control starts showing up. There's a silent difference between a man who feels jealousy and a man who becomes controlled by it. The first guy stays rational even while feeling uncomfortable. The second guy loses clarity, starts imagining scenarios, creates competition in his own head, and turns the woman into the center of his validation. And the scary part is that women usually notice that energy shift long before the man admits it to himself. But here's where things get interesting. Once a man learns to control his emotions instead of fighting for attention, the entire dynamic starts changing in ways almost nobody expects. Topic 3. Why emotional control is more attractive than competition. There's something many men take years to understand. Women pay way more attention to a man's emotional stability than his ability to compete with other men. Because honestly, anybody can compete. Any guy can try to impress, provoke, chase, or fight for attention. But staying calm when your ego gets challenged, that's rare. and rare always stands out. An emotionally controlled man gives off a quiet sense of security that doesn't need constant validation or performance. Think about two men facing the exact same situation. One immediately starts posting indirect shots online, changing his behavior, and trying to look better than everybody else. The other guy stays focused on his own life, keeps his composure, avoids emotional competition, and simply watches. Which one seems more valuable? The second man sends a powerful message without even speaking. My stability doesn't depend on anyone's approval. And that changes the emotional dynamic completely, because people who are used to controlling reactions usually feel uncomfortable when they meet someone who can't be easily shaken. And here's a truth people rarely say out loud. Men who constantly compete for female attention almost always end up looking emotionally overavailable. It's like someone desperately trying to sell something. The harder they push, the less valuable they seem. But emotionally controlled men create the opposite effect. They don't need to convince anyone of their worth. And ironically, that lack of neediness is exactly what increases attraction. But emotional control doesn't mean becoming cold, distant, or fake. There's a huge difference between emotional maturity and pretending not to care. And that's exactly where most men get lost without realizing it. Topic 4. What emotionally intelligent men do. Instead, emotionally intelligent men don't try to win emotional games. They simply refuse to play them, and that changes everything. While most people react impulsively, chase attention, or try to prove their value, emotionally mature men do something much more powerful. They observe patterns. They pay attention to behavior, not just words. Because words can be strategic, but emotional patterns almost never lie. And once a man learns that, he stops wasting energy trying to decode every tiny detail like it's some secret message. Instead of getting dragged into emotional competition, he redirects his focus back to his own life. He keeps training, working, hanging out with friends, building goals, and strengthening his mindset. That's not playing hard to get. That's emotional priority. A strong man understands that putting all his attention into one woman creates silent emotional dependency. And dependency changes masculine energy completely. That's why so many men who seem confident at first slowly become insecure once they get emotionally attached. They abandon their own lives trying to maintain constant access to someone else's attention. There's an old saying that explains this perfectly. Whoever controls your attention controls your life. And very few people realize how true that is in modern relationships. Emotionally intelligent men understand that peace of mind matters more than temporarily winning emotional arguments. Sometimes the strongest response isn't confrontation. It's simply lowering emotional investment and watching who someone becomes when they no longer have unlimited access to your energy. And that's exactly when many men begin discovering an uncomfortable truth about the real reason behind those jealousy games. Topic 5. Why she wants your reaction more than the other guy. Here's a truth that completely changes how many men see these situations. Most of the time, the focus isn't even the other guy. The real focus is his emotional reaction. That's why some women almost seem to watch quietly after posting something provocative or mentioning another man. They want to measure impact. They want confirmation that they still have emotional influence. Because deep down, being able to affect someone emotionally creates a silent feeling of power and validation. And the stronger the man's reaction is, the stronger that emotional confirmation feels. The problem is that many men interpret this as direct competition between men, when in reality the emotional test is usually about control over the dynamic itself. It's almost like she's asking without saying a word, do I still have access to his emotions? And the crazy part is that most men answer that question immediately. All it takes is a change in texting tone, visible irritation, weird behavior, or trying to make her jealous back. Without realizing it, he confirms exactly what she wanted to know. And that's when the emotional dynamic slowly starts turning against him. Experienced men understand something that changes the entire game. People who desperately need reactions are usually more emotionally invested than they seem. Emotionally secure people rarely feel the need to constantly test control. And once a man realizes that, he stops seeing these situations as personal threats. Instead of going to emotional war, he protects his own stability. Because there's a silent kind of power that appears when someone realizes they can no longer easily control your emotions. And that's exactly when detachment starts transforming the entire relationship dynamic. Topic 6. The power of detachment and silent confidence. There's a type of confidence that doesn't make noise. It doesn't need to prove anything, compete, or constantly chase validation. And that's exactly the energy a man starts developing once he understands the true meaning of emotional detachment. A lot of people confuse detachment with coldness, pride, or fake indifference. But that's not what it is. Healthy detachment means his emotional peace no longer depends entirely on another person's behavior. It means he can genuinely care about someone without losing himself in the process. A man who develops this naturally starts behaving differently. He stops obsessively checking social media, stops treating every detail like a threat, and stops living in constant emotional anxiety. And interestingly enough, it even changes his presence. Because anxiety always leaks into someone's energy. You can feel when a man is desperately trying to maintain control of a situation. But emotionally centered men create the opposite effect: calmness, stability, and quiet confidence. And very few things are harder to manipulate than someone who has learned how to control his own mind. Maybe the most interesting part is this: emotional silence often creates more impact than long emotional arguments ever could. When a man stops reacting impulsively, the entire dynamic sometimes changes almost instantly. Because people who are used to provoking emotions usually expect predictability. They expect anger, jealousy, chasing, or emotional outbursts. But when they're met with genuine calmness, they start realizing they no longer have access to that man's emotional center. And that's when things start shifting internally. But there's a very important line between healthy detachment and completely walking away, and very few men know when that moment finally arrives. Topic 7. When walking away becomes the strongest move. There comes a moment when continuing to insist stops being a sign of love and starts becoming self-abandonment. And a lot of men don't realize when they cross that line. They believe persistence will always be seen as proof of value, maturity, or real feelings. But the truth is that constantly fighting for someone who keeps playing with your emotions slowly destroys any man's self-esteem. Because nobody stays emotionally strong while constantly begging for reciprocity. Emotionally mature men understand that not every battle deserves to be fought. Sometimes the strongest move isn't convincing someone to stay, it's accepting their behavior as the answer. And that hurts. Because the male ego usually wants to win the situation. It wants to prove value, regain attention, or change the other person's perception. But there's a trap hidden inside that mindset. The more a man tries to be chosen by someone emotionally inconsistent, the more disconnected he becomes from his own self-worth. And, ironically, that almost always makes the dynamic worse instead of better. Walking away doesn't mean the feelings were fake. It means self-respect finally became stronger than emotional crumbs. And here's something most men learn way too late. People can only keep playing with your emotions as long as you remain available for the game. When a man truly accepts that he deserves stability, reciprocity, and respect, something inside him changes. His energy changes. His posture changes. Even the way people see him changes. Because at the end of the day, there's a silent transformation that happens when a man stops chasing external validation and starts building genuine self-respect instead. Topic 8. The shift that happens when you finally respect yourself. The biggest shift happens when a man stops trying to be enough for someone else and starts becoming enough for himself. It sounds simple, but it completely changes the way he moves through life. Men who constantly depend on female validation live emotionally vulnerable. One ignored message changes their mood. One sign of rejection destroys their confidence. But men who build self-respect create a kind of stability that no longer depends on someone else's approval to exist. And the interesting part is that self-respect doesn't show up in motivational speeches. It shows up in quiet decisions. It shows up when a man chooses not to chase someone who keeps playing with his emotions. When he maintains his routine, purpose, and dignity, even while feeling tempted to run after her. When he understands that self-esteem isn't arrogance, it's simply refusing to tolerate certain behavior out of fear of losing someone. And ironically, that's usually when women start seeing him differently. Because emotionally balanced people radiate something rare nowadays: presence without desperation. Maybe this is one of the most important lessons a man can learn about relationships. Real power was never about controlling another person. It was never about creating more jealousy, winning emotional battles, or pretending not to care. Real power comes from controlling yourself, from building a life so internally solid that nobody can easily destroy your emotional peace anymore. And once a man finally understands that, he stops chasing validation and naturally starts attracting respect instead. Conclusion. At the end of the day, the real question was never, why is she trying to make me jealous? The real question is, why does it still have so much power over your emotions? Because an emotionally strong man isn't someone who never feels jealousy. It's someone who refuses to lose himself because of it. And maybe that's exactly what's missing in modern relationships today. Men who know how to control their own minds before trying to control the situation. So let me ask you this in the comments. Have you ever realized someone was intentionally trying to provoke an emotional reaction out of you? And how did you react in that moment? Do you think men today are becoming emotionally stronger or more addicted to validation? If this video opened your mind in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here we talk about masculinity, self-respect, psychology, and relationships in a way most men have never heard before. And remember, our goal right now is to reach 1,000 subscribers, so join the community and grow with us.